Hello and welcome to the People Grow Places podcast, where we explore the virtuous circle of people, growth and place. Brought to you by Grow Places and hosted by our founder, Tom Larsson. Today we have a special episode recorded on site at the Truman Brewery in East London, where we are excited to work in partnership with the Truman Brewery and local people in Brick Lane, Spitalfields and Bangortown.
So here we are back at the Truman Brewery. We're here on the corner of Spital Street, just outside Allen Gardens. And we're here with Lukas from Carmody Groarke. Hi, Lukas.
Hello.
Hi. Thanks for coming back and joining us on a drier day where we can do some better recording. So tell me a bit about your role at Carmody Groarke, but also your role here at the Truman Brewery.
Yeah, so I'm Associate Director at Carmody Groarke. We've been involved in designing two buildings as part of the master plan. Those two buildings are one new building, a workspace, and one existing building, which will be a refurbishment of the Cooperage.
Okay, and where's that going to happen?
So that's just over here on Spital Street. We've got the Cooperage in the middle, and then there's a gap site where our new building will sit alongside.
Okay, and just remind me, what's happening in that new building?
So that building will be basically workspace. There'll be retail and some community space and ground floor, and then basically modern workspace, which will be aimed towards the kind of creative kind of industries.
So the workspace will reflect the sort of the vibrancy that we tend to associate Truman Brewery with.
Yeah, I think that part of our ethos is to continue the kind of creative spirit of reusing buildings here, making buildings that are very easily adaptable, that can support lots of different kind of creative uses, or even making things like the brewery did before.
Cool. So there could be artists working in spaces.
Absolutely.
Here.
I think that we think of it kind of a little bit like a modern warehouse, something that could support people, painting, making things, sculpture even to, digital work. So I think that the spaces are not going to dictate what, how people use them. I think they're going to be very flexible, very easy to use, and adaptable over time.
And I guess a warehouse style kind of fits in with how we think of the existing Truman Brewery buildings as well, having, given its history. So, how does that then meet with the other areas? How does it sort of sit in this redevelopment site? What's going to happen on the ground floor?
So on the ground floor of both buildings, there'll be lots of vibrant uses. So in the Cooperage, there'll be a kind of basically a community art space, and also a brewery space. So we're literally bringing the brewery back to the Truman Brewery site.
Fantastic.
On the other building that will be new next door, there'll be retail, there'll be some kind of cafe, restaurant spaces, and they're all, I think, in the spirit of the master plan. They're making vibrant spaces at ground floor, so it's going to feel really energetic and very, I think, accessible.
Great. And retail, is that sort of smaller boutiques, or is it a large?
Yeah. It's absolutely in tune with the rest of the master plan. Relatively smaller units, which I think would probably kind of support independent uses. The spaces, I think, are not going to feel too large. They're going to, I think, support the kind of uses that are already here in the area.
And you mentioned a brewery, which is really exciting. So does that have anything to do with this existing space that was made?
So this is the Cooperage. The Cooperage is one of the historic buildings on the site. This is, the Cooperage itself is basically a space for making barrels. Traditionally, a Cooperage is where people would physically make wooden barrels for the storage of beer. Obviously, that process has changed over a number of years, but what's really interesting about spaces like this in the brewery is that they've all adapted over time. Even though this was specifically built as a space for making barrels, it has kind of evolved and has been creatively kind of reused. And that's really, that taps into that spirit of what we've been trying to achieve with, our new spaces. It's very much in that, in the ethos of reusing and making buildings adaptable over time.
And supporting craftsmanship as well. It feels like if you're making space, creative space for artists and artisans, as well as retail spaces for them to potentially sell their wares, and then you're sort of bringing, the history, I suppose, back, because at the moment it doesn't feel like this is a building that is very well used.
Yeah, well, I think that that might be the impression from this side. It does, you can see that the architecture is quite formal here.
What does that mean?
So, well, from a kind of architecture perspective, this building is quite kind of carefully composed on this street edge. You have a relatively flat facade with a central passageway, which was where the horse and carts would have been delivering the barrels to and from the brewery itself. You have two sets of windows that are basically symmetrical either side. So there is a kind of compositional formality to this building, which is actually very different to the interior of the brewery.
Okay.
And that's something that one of the characteristics about how the brewery kind of sits at the moment is it has this kind of quite polite and consistent edge, and actually the interior is very different. And that is really, I think, one of the interesting kind of historic characteristics that we've tried to bring into the architecture of our new building, actually, when we talk about that on the inside. I think that one of the things that we're definitely conscious of is that the building feels very closed at the moment. So we very much want to bring some vibrancy to either side of the passageway. So there'll be new activity on both sides as the passageway is opened up. And I think one of the critical things about the master plan as a whole is that we've recognised that the Cooperage plays a really significant part of the kind of historic memory of the site as an industrial site. So we're very much keeping the passageway as one of the primary pedestrian routes through and into the site. So maintaining this building kind of in situ, giving it a new lease of life, but very much using it as kind of one of those historic kind of reference points for the rest of the master plan.
Yeah. And as well as Lukas says, historically this was a really important entrance to the brewery, but it hasn't been a brewery for 30 years. So this street, we're on the western side of Spital Street now, has pretty much been inactive and closed as far as the brewery extent goes for 30 years. Yeah. So any people living in these residential homes here have never really sort of felt that they can access the brewery.
Yeah.
They've never felt like there's a route in here.
And by brewery, you mean the Truman Brewery,
I mean the
not
brewery
an
estate. I don't mean the brewery. I mean the land that is part of the Truman Brewery estate that we're trying to open up.
Yeah.
And this is a really key move. Both, it's quite simple. It's actually opening doors.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like literal and metaphorical in terms of what we want to try and do here, and bring people into the estate, particularly from sort of east to west and in from the residential neighbourhoods. So that it feels much more accessible and has a front this way. It's not going to be as vibrant, it's not going to be as busy as Brick Lane, and that's right, it doesn't want to be. It's quieter, there's people living here. That's right. But it should feel like you can actually access the brewery from this side, you can use the public spaces, you can use the facilities that are going to be provided.
And if we're making beer here, presumably there's going to be a bit of a beer garden, right? There has to be somewhere to sit and drink. So, this feels like it's going to become quite an important social space as part of the redevelopment.
Yeah, I think when we see the building from the other side, we'll be able to get a sense of the kind of public spaces that are being created as part of the master plan. Mm-hmm. This building and the new building next door are both in a position where they essentially address new public yards. So, this building obviously sits as the backdrop to one of those, and the little micro-brewery that we're doing in the ground floor here is going to play a key part in how one of those spaces is activated. So I think it's very much kind of using this building as the kind of social kind of reference point for how some of those spaces are going to work.
Yeah, I think, and just to add to that, as Lukas is saying, let's talk about the outdoor space and the vibrancy on that side. I think on this side it's also important to recognise kind of the character of where we are, and we do anticipate that this will be a calmer street. It will remain quieter, and also we're not talking about a sort of a boozer or like a late night drinking venue here. We're talking about a space for production, a space that is about local craft and making, and that happens to be beer. And there probably will be a sort of a small tap room associated with that where people can have a drink and sit out and experience the space. But we're not anticipating, putting a late night pub or boozer on this side of the street next to the residential.
So it'd be a social space for gathering, but not necessarily an interruption to those who are living here.
And there's lots of examples of them around East London, but other places as well. So
all that action is going to happen inside here. Should we take a look in the space?
Yeah, it's actually fortunate today that these gates are open, because again, these gates are often shut.
Yeah.
This is an existing loading route in and out of the site, which is used by Truman, and we want to retain that as well in the proposal. So we're now at the site of Lukas's new building that you talk about, but there's an intention to retain some form of access route through here, but it to also have a street presence and a frontage, and sort of fill in this gap in the street, really.
Yeah, I think that's one of the important moves of the master plan, certainly in terms of this building, which would be called Plot 1. So we intend to essentially complete the street frontage here. So you can see that there's a residential building just to the south of us here, and the Cooperage there that is kind of part of essentially a very typical London terrace. And we thought it was important to essentially contain the energy within the master plan and kind of almost give this street the sense of protection that I think it already has. So it is quite a quiet street, and the building will effectively be a buffer between the two. The new building is essentially taking the same kind of massing heights and same kind of building forms that are already here, referencing those in a kind of particular way that I think does a really good job in making a consistent streetscape, which is, I think, really important when you recognise that the character here is very different to the interior of the master plan.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe let's now move inside, which again, this isn't a route that people can or would take currently into the site. But in the future there will be the ability to move through, and now we're back in what very much feels like the private heart yard space of the brewery, which we've talked about.
That's right. So there's never really any public access. This is often full of white vans coming in and out as they deliver goods to the various buildings here in this central yard. But all of that will change. There'll be public access and there'll be spaces or hubs. There'll be. You spoke of 2 yards. Can you give us an explanation on that?
The master plan has been a collaborative process where we've very much looked at the kind of pattern of how buildings have existed on this site for almost 300 years. It's been a very kind of tight, granular perimeter, and the buildings in the middle have kind of existed as per the kind of industrial needs of the brewery. So there were buildings that were kind of lean-tos, and there were sheds that were located within this yard space. And obviously now you get a real sense of the scale as it, apart from the kind of temporary thing that they're doing here, you can really get a sense of the unusual scale. What the master plan recognises is that the kind of relatively tight yard spaces that you'll see essentially around the Truman Brewery itself, and particularly part of post-industrial London sites, is that there is a particular energy that you can create from kind of basically making those spaces quite compact. What we're doing here, in reference to the Cooperage, is that there'll be a new yard space here, Cooperage Yard, and there'll be a new yard space over here, which is Black Eagle Yard.
Right.
And those two form a kind of pivot between two of the key entrances in and out of the site. So again, using the Cooperage as one of those kind of key reference points, as that backdrop will be completely maintained. We're going to lightly refurbish that one, but the new building essentially sits as the kind of point where it addresses 2 new yards. And those yards will have slightly different characters. They'll all be connected, but there'll be a different character to each, obviously activated in different ways by the various buildings that sit around and create those yards.
Talk us through those characters. I'm curious about that.
A lot of what we're doing is trying to bring back a sense of I think industrial. There is an industrial reference point that I think is being used throughout the master plan, and the landscape design I think is taking some of those clues. We're going to be using things like existing cobbles that we're kind of taking from elsewhere in the brewery and laying There'll be new planting. I think that's really important in making spaces that feel more diverse in terms of their kind of environment.
So
and there'll be more shade,
shrubs and trees.
more shrubs, more greenery. I think that a lot of this is trying to make spaces that feel like they can be used for lots of different ways. This is not just people standing in the street. This is people, families. This is the community that feel like you can come and sit there on any given day. And I think that the landscape is going to be subtly different as you move around.
Okay. Yes. And what about the character of the other yard?
So Black Eagle Yard is a slightly different character in that it's the kind of termination point of New Dray Walk, which is just over here.
Okay.
So that's part of one of the first phases of the Truman's master plan idea, and that will feature more, I think, retail. So there'll be more retail, a bit more food and beverage offers. Our building will sit as the kind of end point there. So there'll be a new yard that I think very much feels like it is focused towards hospitality. There's independent shops, and I think that will feel very vibrant. It may change slightly more over here, where the feel might be more
open, more of a sort of open park kind of.
Yeah. And it's worth pointing out that the Black Eagle Yard is part of the previous permission that was granted as part of the Woodley Street permission, and Lukas's building here, block 1, as we've said, and the Cooperage, they're on the boundary of where kind of this project that Grow Places are working on with Truman starts, and the one that's already consented ends. But as Lukas says, we're still trying to sort of complete the jigsaw in that sense.
Integrate everything together.
Fill in
the pieces.
It's quite a tough challenge, because you have to kind of almost anticipate what will be the energy and the feel of that. Obviously, it's not implemented yet. So you're designing, anticipating a certain way in which that space will behave, and obviously we're trying our best to make the building kind of address two different sides and probably two different feels, and at the same time stitch everything together.
Well, we're so close to central London transport hubs here.
Yeah.
We're so close to really important sort of commercial zones and office spaces. It feels like a very logical process to activate this sort of space. And what I mean by activate is, of course, invite more people in, spaces to sit down, feel comfortable, and have some social time together, as well as providing space for artists and space for boutiques and
So I think all of that is absolutely right, and I agree absolutely with what you're saying. And some of those kind of big picture decisions as to why you would develop this site make a lot of sense. But then when we're talking about for local people and local communities, it then becomes about, okay, well, what does this really mean for them and for their daily lives? And we've kind of talked about some of that on Spital Street, about the fact that we're going to open that up, but the character's not going to change too much. But behind us on the site of Lukas's building, we're kind of all stood next to the centralised waste facility for the Truman Brewery, which at the moment, if you had a blank sheet of paper, this may not be the optimum place to put it, right next to people's flats. So as part of the project, we have a strategy to relocate that somewhere else within the brewery, which is away from where people are living, and then we can bring forward something that is hopefully a better neighbour as well. A much better neighbour. I think that the visual amenity of what we're doing, I think, is going to be a vast improvement of what's here at the moment. I think the architecture of this building has to be kind of very multi-dimensional. So as I said, on Spital Street, that elevation has to be a bit more polite, a bit more consistent with the streetscape.
What do you mean by polite?
Well, in the buildings have a kind of particular line that I think is already established. That's a historic line that feels like it shouldn't really be interfered with. It feels like it's a consistency of one building to the other, and actually the gap in the site is one of the irregular parts of the site, and actually creating that infill is one of those reinstalling that consistency of streetscape. I think the character on this side, as I said before, epitomised by the Cooperage, which has a very different look and feel on this side. I described it as more composed on one side. Here, the building is essentially made up of lots of different kind of components. The ground floor has been opened up and changed over many years. You can see that there are different beams at different heights. That irregular character is actually really interesting. We like that. We want to work with that and in some ways celebrate that. The building that will be its neighbour now is going to have a very particular form that responds to those two different yards and creates I think a much better relationship with its neighbours because of that. So the building form will be quite figured. It won't be a kind of consistent edge, as I said before. It will be much more angular, responding to those different conditions. Particularly on this side, we've been very careful to make sure that the building gives as much light and air as possible, but crucially a better visual amenity. So there'll be green roofs, there'll be lots of biodiverse planting that will be pretty much all over the building on its kind of various terraces. So a much better visual amenity for the neighbours next door, and hopefully a much more vibrant kind of ground level because of that.
I mean, I can see that people's home windows open out onto this waste facility.
I can imagine it can be quite challenging.
Smells, noises, all of that visually as well. So anything would be an improvement, I assume. So then, just back to this building here. It looks like a historic building. Is it listed? Do we have? Is it got any sort of?
It's a good question. So the building is not listed. It is, however, a very important historical, as I said, reference point for the rest of the brewery. It's been adapted many times over its lifespan. We know from some of the historic information, and certainly you can see the kind of residual difference in the brick tone. That's actually where there was a building kind of previously attached, a lean-to, as I said. So the process of making barrels in that building were brought into a space that was essentially open air, rolled out into some of the yard space, filled with the beer and brought out again. This building has, consequently been adapted so many times. Its current use as kind of creative workspace is very much in tune with what we've been talking about, is that spirit of using buildings flexibly, making them quite unself-conscious. So the buildings don't tell you precisely how you can behave in them. They let you kind of do whatever you want. And I think if you ever walk around the existing offices in there, you'll see very much that the spaces are used in lots of really interesting ways. And I think that's really what we're kind of drawing inspiration from for the new buildings.
Yeah. And I think, as you say, Lukas, the Cooperage is a really interesting and important building for the site. Yes, it's not listed, but it's really great. And then you've got the boiler house, which is where obviously the iconic Truman chimney is. But then if you look around the rest of the site, I don't think many people would have too many complaints about the quality of these sheds or this waste compactor being replaced with some really well designed, really well thought through buildings that are flexible and adaptable. So I think actually, as far as development sites go, actually what to keep and what to look to reuse or to recycle was, we got to that quite quickly as a team, didn't we, for this? And obviously retaining the Cooperage is really important. The other thing I think is quite nice about, this has an identity, the Cooperage. It's not been placed to make barrels for minimum 30 years, probably longer, because the technology would have changed. Similarly, the boiler house, that's not had boilers in it for, again, a similar amount of time, but they have an identity because of that. So at the moment, we're talking about block 1 and we're talking about block 2, block 3, which is, they're not the most personal names or they won't be the eventual names, but how can we kind of bring character and bring familiarity to the place through how these buildings are named and how they're occupied. And these are just some of the things which we think about as a team, but actually go well beyond the brief of planning. They go into life and to operation and how these places are kind of humanised over time.
I think that what's lovely about Brick Lane in general, and particularly about the Truman Brewery, it's been adopted by a kind of community that has grown ever since the current owners have kind of owned the site. buildings have been adapted, as Tom said. Their industrial uses have fallen away, but they've been reused in really interesting ways. And I think you've got a really strong sense of community here that has grown with the brewery. I think we've recognised that some of these buildings don't provide a lot of sustainable uses over a long period of time. They're quite particular to certain uses that the brewery had before, but they don't particularly support much in the future. So we've said, okay, well, let's use what we've got and use that spirit. And in some way, I think that the kind of idiosyncratic nature of what we've got and how we're working around it will, I think, hopefully inspire a new kind of adaptation of these spaces, very much in line with how the other buildings have kind of grown into the consciousness of London life.
So this is an investment for the future, is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe just as a sort of final point on this, I think is that I think the success of this project will be that the community that Lukas has just mentioned, the people who, work on the brewery site, come here and visit, that they feel as excited about the future of this site as the local residents or local businesses do outside the site. And then that is the success in the future, is that the various aspects of the wider community, but also the particularities of any one group kind of opens up, and it feels like a place where all can enjoy. And I think that's really the aspiration here for the project.
Well, especially if we're introducing new homes and additional workspaces, there has to be a really good place for everyone to mix comfortably.
And that's the public realm. It's maybe a phrase that people don't understand in terms of what does public realm mean, but that is really that. It's kind of the bits between the buildings. It's the way that the spaces are enlivened and how they're accessed and how you can just kind of come into a space and enjoy it and not necessarily feel like you have to buy a t-shirt or have a beer or something. You can just kind of experience those spaces. So
you can sit under a tree.
Yeah, like that sort of that transformational nature that we just described about Spital Street never really feeling like the brewery to it feeling like the front door to the brewery.
Right.
That's a really nice transition that hopefully this project can bring forward.
And talk to us a little bit about your new building. It'll be a new building. So what kind of considerations have been given to making it as environmentally consciously sustainable as possible?
I mean, we're really interested and passionate about making buildings that are sustainable. I think the opportunity that we have on our new build site is that we have quite a compact site, and I think what that means is that we can very much use as low carbon solutions as we possibly can. So we have predominantly timber frame building, which is great. We have because of the relatively shallow floor plates that are created by the compact size, we can very much promote natural ventilation. Mm-hmm. So that very much decreases the demand on any mechanical needs, and it means that users can, literally do
open
things
a window.
As simple as opening a window,
yep.
and just activate their own spaces and find their own kind of comfort levels as they see.
And have a sense of control over that.
Exactly. And the building will be orientated in a particular way with certain shading devices over windows to essentially limit as much as we can heat gain. All these are all kind of passive environmental ideas that I think go together to make a building that I think will be, firstly very low carbon in construction, but very low carbon in its use over its lifespan. I think the other side of sustainability is designing buildings that can be very adaptable. And as I said, that buildings that are able to kind of see a lifespan past their first intended use, and as the buildings have proved on the site already, the buildings that last for a very long time and prove to be adaptable tend to be the ones that are more sustainable in the long term. And we've designed our building so that it can be adaptable in that same spirit. So there's nothing to stop that building being adapted into different uses over its lifespan.
That's right. There's no need to knock it down because people can use it in different ways for different functionalities.
It's that kind of modern warehouse kind of idea that you start with something that can be flexible. And I think as patterns of work or the economy or social life changes, the building should be able to kind of tolerate those changes through its kind of primary structure, and I think that's very much how we see the building operating.
Yeah, and I also, just to add to that, I think in a situation where there's a climate crisis, people actually fundamentally ask, well, should you be building new buildings? But actually, this is an example where I think absolutely yes. Like, this is a brownfield site. It's very well connected.
Yeah.
It's underutilized, as Lukas said. There's a gap site here from where buildings obviously have once stood. And these are the places that we should be building buildings, whether that's refurbs or whether that's new. And then once that's kind of established, then it's really on the creativity of designers like Lukas to then say, okay, well, how do we do that in a really responsible way? And some of those measures that Lukas just described. So
there's going to be an added sort of social and possibly economic argument, as it were, for having something new here, because it will be so well used, and because you're going to design it so well that we can use it for another 100, 200 years potentially.
Well, there's something about looking back in, the site has been a brewery for 300 or so years. This has been a site of industry for a very, very long time, and I think that the current custodians of the site very much see the kind of continuation of that. I just see us as being a kind of just another step in just the site's industrial use for the next 100 or so years, and I think that's a really nice way to think about spaces like this. I think, as Tom said, it's incredibly well connected. It's already very busy. The site is so well used elsewhere, but this is incredibly contrasting. It's very kind of secluded and it's very private. And I think that opening up that site will be a really great benefit to a space that is already a really much loved part of the community, from visitors to people that already live here.
Well, it's giving private land over to the public again, isn't it? It's allowing that access. Well, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Lukas. Thanks for your time and walking us through that today.
My pleasure.
It's a complicated sort of system, but actually you've made it sound really simple, and very excited to see what the results are. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to the Grow Places podcast. For more information, visit growplaces.com and follow us at We Grow Places across all social channels. See you next time.